My dad gave my baby an empty box as a gift for her first birthday. When I married Ronnie, my father acted like I'd personally betrayed him because she was a mechanic instead of some lawyer or doctor he could brag about. He literally told me on my wedding day that he gave it 2 years max. But when Ronnie got pregnant, I thought things would change because he'd always talked about wanting grandchildren. I was completely wrong. From the moment I told him we were expecting, he acted like it wasn't happening. He'd change the subject immediately whenever I mentioned the baby. When I showed him ultrasound pictures, he'd glance at them for half a second, then start talking about his golf league or his neighbor's new fence or literally anything else. He threw a fit when I asked him to come to the baby shower, saying he had booked a fishing trip that same weekend, even though I'd told him the date 2 months earlier. Ronnie's mother threw the shower instead, and my own father didn't even send a gift. When Owen was born, my father didn't come to the hospital. He said hospitals were full of germs, and he didn't want to get sick. My mother came alone and held Owen for hours while my father stayed home reorganizing his workbench. He didn't meet Owen until he was 3 weeks old, and even then he refused to hold him. I don't want to drop him, he said, standing 6 feet away like Owen had some disease. But he'd held all my cousins' babies no problem. He'd post constantly on social media about being a proud grandfather to my brother's kids who lived across the country, but not a single photo or mention of Owen, who lived 20 minutes away. When people asked him about his grandchildren, he'd only talk about my brother's twins. If someone specifically asked about my son, he'd say, "Oh, right, the baby," and immediately change the subject. He'd come to our house and sit in the living room while Owen was right there in his bouncer and act like he was invisible. He'd talk to me and Ronnie about everything except the baby that was literally right in front of him. If Owen cried, he'd make this disgusted face and say, "Can't you take him to another room? I'm trying to visit with you," like Owen was some annoying pet instead of his grandson. Family dinners were the worst. He'd set up high chairs for my brother's kids when they visited, but told me to keep Owen in his car seat on the floor because he didn't want food on his furniture. He'd pass around photos of my brother's kids to relatives, but when I tried to show Owen's photos, he'd interrupt and say, "Everyone's already seen them on your social media. They don't need to see them again." He'd buy expensive gifts for my brother's kids and send me links to garage sales for Owen's stuff. The breaking point came at Owen's first birthday. I'd planned this small party, just family and a few close friends. My father said he'd come, but showed up 2 hours late after all the guests had arrived. He walked in carrying this elaborate gift bag, and I actually thought maybe he'd finally come around. He made this big show of placing it on the gift table, then sat in the corner on his phone the entire party. When it came time to open presents, I saved his for last, thinking it would be special. Owen was sitting on my lap as I opened this beautifully wrapped box inside the fancy bag. It was empty, completely empty, except for a card that said, "For Owen's college fund with nothing inside. No check, no cash, no bonds, nothing. Just an empty card and an empty box in a fancy gift bag." Everyone went silent. My father just stared at me with this smirk and said, "What? I thought you'd appreciate the gesture. Money's been tight since I've been helping your brother with the twins' preschool." My father-in-law lost it. He stood up in front of everyone and said, "What kind of grandfather gives an empty box to a 1-year-old? What's wrong with you?" My father tried to act offended, saying, "I don't appreciate being attacked in my son's home." That's when my uncle stood up. "You haven't touched that baby once in a year because you can't stand his mother. We've all watched you pretend Owen doesn't exist while you post about your other grandchildren 50 times a day." My father tried to deny it, but my cousin pulled out his phone and started scrolling through my father's social media. "Look, here's 20 posts about the twins from last week. Where's Owen? Oh, right, not a single mention in an entire year." My mother, who never spoke up about anything, finally said, "I'm ashamed of you. You've punished an innocent baby because you don't approve of who his mother is. Ronnie's been nothing but good to our son, and Owen is a blessing you've chosen to ignore." My father's jaw dropped. He tried to sputter something about being misunderstood, but my mother cut him off. "You've had a year to show you care about this child, and you've chosen not to. I'm ashamed." She said it again, louder this time, and the room went completely silent. My father-in-law moved to my side and put his hand on my shoulder, while Owen sat on the floor tearing into wrapping paper, completely unaware that his grandfather had just been exposed in front of everyone. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness wash over me because I'd spent 12 months wondering if I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. But here were all these people who'd watched it happen, confirming that yes, my father had deliberately pretended my son didn't exist. My father looked around the room like he expected someone to defend him, but everyone just stared back. My cousin held up his phone, showing post after post about the twins with zero mentions of Owen. My uncle crossed his arms and shook his head. Even some of the friends who'd come looked uncomfortable, clearly piecing together that they'd just witnessed something bigger than a bad gift. My father grabbed his keys off the counter and stood up fast enough that his chair scraped against the floor. He headed straight for the door without looking at anyone, his boots hitting hard against the hardwood. I expected my mother to follow him like she always did when he stormed off during family arguments, but she didn't move. She stayed sitting in her chair and watched him leave. And when the door slammed shut behind him, she turned to me with this exhausted look on her face. "Can I hold him?" Her voice came out shaky and quiet. She reached her hands toward Owen, who was still playing with ribbons and and bows, totally oblivious to the drama. I nodded and picked Owen up, placing him in my mother's arms. She held him close against her chest, and her eyes got watery as she stroked his hair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to him, even though he couldn't understand. "I should have said something months ago." Ronnie stood next to me and squeezed my hand, while my mother rocked Owen gently back and forth. That evening, after everyone left and we'd cleaned up the party mess, Ronnie and I sat on the couch in the quiet house. Owen had fallen asleep in his crib upstairs, worn out from all the excitement and cake. I kept replaying the whole scene in my head, seeing my father's face when everyone called him out, hearing my mother's voice crack when she said she was ashamed. Ronnie pulled me close, and I rested my head on her shoulder. "I need to tell you something," she said after a few minutes of silence. "I felt your dad's judgment since the day we met. The way he'd look at my hands when I picked you up for dates, how he'd ask what my career plans were like being a mechanic, wasn't a real job." Her voice stayed steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath. "When I got pregnant, I thought maybe he'd get over it, but then he just acted like Owen wasn't real. Like if he ignored us long enough, we'd disappear or you'd leave me." I lifted my head to look at her and saw pain in her eyes that I hadn't fully recognized before. "I never wanted you to have to choose between me and your family," she continued. "So I just kept my mouth shut and took it. But watching him give our son an empty box today, seeing that smirk on his face, I realized he's been punishing Owen for having me as a mother." I grabbed her hand tight because I didn't know what else to do. She'd been dealing with my father's cruelty this whole time and never complained because she didn't want to make things harder for me. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:00. I saw my father's name on the screen and my stomach dropped. I answered, and before I could even say hello, he started yelling, "I want an apology for how I was treated yesterday. I was humiliated in front of everyone in your home." His voice was sharp and angry, like he was the victim in all this. I took a deep breath and kept my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. "I'm not apologizing. Everyone pointed out what you've been doing for a year. You've ignored Owen and treated him like he doesn't exist because you don't approve of Ronnie." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then he said, "How dare you speak to me that way? I've done nothing wrong. That gift was perfectly appropriate." I felt anger rise up in my chest. An empty box isn't a gift. It was cruel and everyone saw it. He made this disgusted sound. "You've always been dramatic. I don't have to sit here and listen to this." Then he hung up on me. I stood there holding my phone, staring at the blank screen, realizing that my father genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. 2 days later, my mother showed up at our front door alone. She was carrying several wrapped packages and looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I opened the door wider and she walked into the living room where Owen was playing with blocks on the floor. She set the packages down on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the couch. "These are Owen's real birthday gifts," she said. "I bought them weeks ago, but your father wouldn't let me bring them to the party. He said the empty box was the only thing we were giving." I felt my chest tighten. She'd wanted to give Owen actual presents, but my father had stopped her. "I want to see Owen regularly if that's okay with you," she continued. "Weekly visits, helping out, being an actual grandmother instead of pretending he doesn't exist." Her voice got thick with emotion. "Your father refuses to talk about what happened. He's telling everyone he's the victim and that you're keeping him from his grandchild. But we both know that's not true." I watched Owen stack blocks while my mother explained that my father was acting like the confrontation at the party never happened. He deleted all the social media posts about the twins that my cousin had shown everyone and was now posting about family betrayal instead. I told my mother she could visit Owen every week, but I needed to be clear about something. My father isn't welcome here until he actually admits what he's done. Not just says sorry I felt hurt, but genuinely acknowledges that he spent a year rejecting my son because he's ashamed of Ronnie's job. My mother nodded slowly and didn't try to argue or defend him. "I understand," she said, "and I think that's fair, even though it hurts to admit it." She looked sad, but not surprised, like she'd known this was coming. She got down on the floor with Owen and helped him stack blocks, and he laughed when she made silly faces at him. Watching her interact with him made me realize how much he'd missed out on having a grandmother in his life this past year, because my father had controlled when and how she could see him. After an hour, she stood up to leave and hugged me tight at the door. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up to him sooner," she said. "I kept hoping he'd come around on his own, but I was wrong." I told her it wasn't too late to be part of Owen's life, and she smiled sadly before walking back to her car. Later that afternoon, my father-in-law called to check on me. "I've been thinking about you since the party," he said. "I wanted you to know that I dealt with something similar when my first child was born." He explained that his own father had rejected his daughter because he didn't approve of the marriage. It took me a long time to accept that some people can't get past their own prejudices, even when it means hurting innocent children. Setting boundaries with him was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was necessary. He offered to meet for coffee if I wanted to talk through the complicated feelings that come with having to protect your child from your own parent. There's this guilt that comes with it. He continued like somehow you failed by not being able to make them love your baby. But you didn't fail. He did. His words hit me hard because that was exactly how I'd been feeling. Like maybe if I'd tried harder or done things differently, my father would have accepted Owen. But my father-in-law was right. This wasn't my failure. It was my father's choice to let his class prejudice matter more than his grandson. A week after the party, party, my brother sent me a text asking if we could meet up and talk privately. "I need to tell you something that's been bothering me," his message said. I agreed to meet him for coffee while his twins were at preschool. We sat at a table in the back of the shop and he looked nervous, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "I've been really uncomfortable with how differently our father treats our kids," he started, but I didn't know how to bring it up without causing drama in the family. He admitted that he'd noticed our father's constant posts about the twins versus complete silence about Owen. I told myself maybe you didn't want him posting about Owen or that you preferred privacy, but watching what happened at the party made me realize I was making excuses for him. His voice got quieter. I should have said something months ago. I should have called him out when he'd talk about the twins non-stop, but changed the subject whenever you mentioned Owen. Instead, I just stayed quiet because it was easier. I appreciated his honesty, even though part of me wished he'd spoken up sooner. My brother leaned forward and his eyes got serious. "There's something else you need to know. Our father has been making comments about Ronnie since you two started dating. He's told me multiple times that you married beneath yourself and that he expected better from you." I felt my face get hot with anger. He's compared Ronnie to my wife constantly, talking about how at least I married someone with a respectable career. "I'm so sorry I never told you this before." He reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Watching everyone confront him at Owen's party made me realize that by staying silent, I was enabling his cruelty. "He's been punishing your son for having Ronnie as a mother, and I just let it happen because I didn't want to rock the boat." Tears started rolling down his cheeks. "I'm ashamed of myself for not protecting Owen. He's my nephew, and he deserved better from me." I squeezed his hand because I could see how guilty he felt. We talked for another hour about our father's behavior patterns and how he'd always been obsessed with appearances and status. My brother promised he'd start calling out our father's favoritism whenever it happened, instead of pretending everything was fine. When I got home, my uncle called. "I need to apologize to you," he said right away. "I should have confronted your father's behavior way before that party. I've watched him ignore Owen for an entire year, and I kept telling myself he'd eventually come around." His voice sounded frustrated with himself. I'd drop hints about how Owen was growing or suggest he post photos of him, thinking maybe gentle nudges would work. But the empty box proved that wasn't enough. He needed to be directly confronted, and I should have done it months ago instead of waiting for things to get that bad. He explained that the whole family had noticed what was happening, but everyone was too afraid of my father's reactions to say anything. "We all failed Owen by staying quiet," he said, "and we failed you by making you deal with this alone instead of backing you up from the beginning." I told him I appreciated the apology and that I understood why people avoid confrontation with my father, since he tends to make everything about how he's being attacked. My uncle agreed but said that wasn't an excuse anymore. That baby deserves grandparents who love him unconditionally, and if your father can't do that, then the rest of us need to step up and make sure Owen knows he's valued. He promised to visit more often and to keep calling out my father's behavior whenever he saw it happening. The days after the party felt different. I'd wake up in the morning and realize I wasn't already thinking about my father's next visit or what he might say or how I could make him finally see Owen. That constant weight in my chest had lifted without me even noticing at first. Ronnie pointed it out one morning while I was playing on the floor with Owen. She said I seemed more relaxed and that I was laughing more with Owen instead of watching the door like I expected my father to walk in and ruin everything. She was right. For an entire year, I'd been trying so hard to win my father's approval that I'd been tense even in my own home. Now that everyone knew the truth, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I could just be Owen's dad without worrying about what my father thought about every single thing I did. My phone buzzed 3 days later with a group text from my father to the entire family. He wrote that he was punished for giving a practical gift and that I was keeping Owen away from his grandparents. I stared at the message, feeling my face get hot. He was actually trying to rewrite what happened and make himself the victim. Before I could even respond, my mother sent a message to the whole group saying that wasn't true at all. She wrote that my father was welcome to see Owen anytime he genuinely wanted to, and that nobody was keeping him away except his own behavior. She said he'd spent a year acting like Owen didn't exist, and that one party confrontation didn't erase 12 months of cruelty. My uncle added a message agreeing with my mother, and my cousin sent a thumbs up. My father didn't respond to the group chat after that, but I could picture his face turning red with anger that my mother had called him out in front of everyone. 3 weeks went by with no contact from my father. Owen was getting bigger every day, and I took tons of photos of him learning to clap and trying new foods. My cousin posted pictures from Owen's birthday party on social media with a caption about family members who truly show up for the children in their lives. The photos showed Owen covered in cake with my father-in-law and my mother smiling in the background. My father commented on the post asking why he wasn't tagged. My cousin responded with a screenshot showing my father's social media page. The screenshot showed 20 posts about my brother's twins from the past month and 0 posts about Owen from his entire first year. My cousin wrote that maybe my father should ask himself why he never posted about Owen if he wanted to be included in Owen's celebration photos. I saw the comment thread blow up with other family members liking my cousin's response. My father deleted his comment, but the damage was done because everyone had already seen it. That same night, my phone rang, and it was my aunt calling to to tell me that my father had blocked my cousin on every social media platform. My aunt said my father had called her screaming about betrayal and family loyalty. My aunt told me she'd stayed calm and explained to my father that telling the truth wasn't betrayal. She said my father needed to take responsibility for treating Owen like he didn't exist for an entire year, instead of getting mad at people for pointing it out. My father had hung up on her, but my aunt didn't seem bothered. She said she was done protecting my father's feelings when my father had spent a year hurting Owen. Sunday came, and Ronnie's parents invited us over for dinner. We drove to their house, and they had set up Owen's high chair at the table like they always did. After we ate, Ronnie's mother brought out this beautiful photo album with Owen's name embossed on the cover. She opened it, and every single page was filled with pictures of Owen from his first year. There were photos from the hospital when he was born, and pictures from every month as he grew. There were photos of Owen with Renata and my father-in-law at the park, and at their house, and at our house during their weekly visits. They'd been documenting Owen's entire first year while my father pretended he didn't exist. I started crying right there at the table, because Owen would always have proof that he was loved and celebrated, even if one grandfather couldn't see his worth. My father-in-law squeezed my shoulder and said they were honored to be part of Owen's life. The next week, I called a therapist named Grant Ellison, who my friend had recommended. I told him the whole story about my father's rejection and the empty box and the party confrontation. Grant listened without interrupting, and then he said something that made me start crying again. He said my father's rejection said everything about my father's problems and nothing about Owen's value. He explained that some people can't get past their own prejudices, even when it means hurting innocent children. He said I was grieving the father I wished I had instead of accepting the father I actually had. We talked about class prejudice and how my father had tied Ronnie's job to her worth as a person, and by extension, Owen's worth as my father's grandchild. Grant helped me understand that protecting Owen from that toxic thinking was the right choice, even though it hurt. My mother kept coming over every Thursday afternoon to spend time with Owen. During one visit, she told me quietly that my father was angry she was choosing sides. She said she'd explained to him that she wasn't choosing sides, but rather choosing to have a relationship with her grandson. She told him that if having a relationship with Owen felt like betrayal, then he needed to ask himself why spending time with his own grandchild threatened him so much. My father apparently didn't have an answer for that. My mother looked tired and sad, but she also looked determined. She said she'd already missed too much of Owen's first year by not standing up to my father sooner, and she wasn't going to miss any more. 4 weeks after the party, I got a long email from my father. The subject line said, "We need to talk." I opened it and started reading. He wrote that he was sorry I felt hurt, but then spent 3 paragraphs defending everything he'd done. He claimed the empty box was about financial responsibility and teaching me to plan for Owen's future instead of wasting money on toys. He said his behavior had nothing to do with Ronnie being a mechanic and everything to do with wanting me to be smart with money. He wrote that he'd been helping my brother pay for the twins' preschool because my brother had asked for help and I never had. The email made my stomach hurt because it was so clearly fake. He wasn't actually sorry, and he wasn't taking any real responsibility for what he'd done. I showed the email to Grant at our next session. He read it carefully and then explained that it was a non-apology. He said my father was apologizing for my feelings instead of apologizing for his actions. Grant helped me see that my father was still trying to justify why his rejection was actually reasonable instead of admitting it was cruel. We spent the session writing a response email together. I wrote that I needed acknowledgement of his year-long pattern of rejection, not justifications for why that rejection made sense. I explained that treating Owen like he was invisible wasn't about financial planning, and we both knew it. I told him that until he could honestly admit what he'd done and why he'd done it, we couldn't move forward. I sent the email and felt scared, but also relieved that I'd been clear about what I needed. My father never responded to my email. A week later, my mother told me that my father had shown her my response and called me unreasonable and dramatic. She said she'd finally lost her patience with him. She told him that their son and grandson didn't need his permission to feel hurt by cruel behavior. She said my father had spent a year punishing a baby for having the wrong mother, and that no amount of justification would make that okay. My mother said my father had gone silent after that and locked himself in their bedroom for hours. She didn't know if he was actually thinking about what he'd done or just angry that people kept calling him out. Either way, she said she was proud of me for standing firm on what I needed even though it was hard. 3 days after my mother told me about my father's version of events, my brother called me crying. I could hear his twins playing loudly in the background while he tried to talk through the tears. He said our father had come over that morning and started comparing our parenting styles. My father told him that he was a better parent than me because he'd married someone appropriate and was raising his children in a stable environment. My brother said he'd had enough at that point. He told our father that Ronnie was a wonderful mother and wife who worked hard to provide for her family. He said job titles don't determine someone's worth as a person, and that our father's obsession with status had damaged our entire family. My father apparently left without saying another word. My brother apologized for not standing up to our father sooner and said he was done enabling the prejudice. I thanked him and told him I understood how hard it was to confront our father because I'd spent years avoiding it myself. The next week, I started noticing noticing a shift in how the family was treating the situation. My brother texted me daily to check on Owen and sent photos of the twins asking when they could have a play date with their cousin. My aunt called to say she'd told several relatives about the empty box incident and that most of them were disgusted by my father's behavior. My cousin posted a photo on social media of Owen from the party with a caption about loving all your family members equally. My father tried to rally support by calling various relatives and explaining his side of the story. He told them I was overreacting and keeping Owen from his grandparents over one misunderstanding. My aunt said most family members weren't buying it because they'd witnessed a year of rejection firsthand. They'd seen my father ignore Owen at family gatherings. They'd noticed he never mentioned Owen when talking about his grandchildren. They'd watched him fuss over the twins while treating Owen like he was invisible. My cousin told me that our great-uncle had called my father and said he was disappointed in his treatment of an innocent baby. Another relative sent my father a long message about how damaging it was to punish a child for his mother's occupation. My father blocked several family members on social media after they commented on his posts asking why he'd given Owen an empty box. 6 weeks after the party, I was folding laundry in the living room while Owen napped upstairs. Ronnie was at the shop and the house was quiet. I heard a car pull into the driveway and looked out the window. My father was walking up to the front door carrying a gift bag. I felt my stomach drop because he hadn't called or texted to say he was coming. He knocked loudly and I walked to the door but didn't open it. He knocked again and said he needed to see Owen. I told him through the door that surprise visits weren't acceptable. I explained that he needed to respect the boundaries I'd set for my family's well-being. He needed to call ahead and ask permission before coming over. He needed to understand that showing up unannounced wasn't going to work anymore. My father's voice got louder through the door. He said I was being ridiculous and that grandfathers should be able to visit their grandchildren whenever they want. I reminded him that he'd spent a year acting like Owen didn't exist, so the grandfather card didn't work anymore. I told him that if he wanted to rebuild a relationship with Owen, it would happen on my terms, not his. He needed to respect our family's boundaries and stop trying to force his way back in after a year of rejection. My father started getting emotional and saying I was cruel to keep a grandfather from his grandchild. He said he'd made mistakes, but that I was punishing him too harshly. I felt my hands shaking as I stood there listening to his voice crack. I told him through the door that he didn't get to act like Owen didn't exist for 12 months and then show up demanding access. I reminded him of every time he'd changed the subject when I mentioned the pregnancy, every time he'd refused to hold Owen or look at photos, every family dinner where he'd kept Owen on the floor in a car seat, every social media post about the twins with zero mention of Owen. I told him that one confrontation at a party didn't erase 12 months of deliberate rejection and cruelty. I heard footsteps on the porch, and then Ronnie's truck pulled into the driveway. She'd come home early from the shop because I'd texted her that my father was here. She walked up to the porch and stood next to my father. She said his name quietly, and he turned to look at her. She told him firmly, but not unkindly, that he wasn't welcome until he could genuinely acknowledge the pain he'd caused. She said Owen deserved better than a grandfather who showed up with gifts after a year of treating him like he was invisible. My father's face changed, and he turned his anger on Ronnie. He called her an insecure grease monkey who had turned his son against him. He said she'd poisoned me against my own family because she was embarrassed about her working-class job. Ronnie looked at him for a long moment and then closed the door calmly without saying another word. I heard my father yelling on the porch for another minute before his car door slammed and he drove away. Ronnie came inside and sat down on the couch. She put her head in her hands and I sat next to her. She said his words hurt more than she expected. She'd known for years that my father looked down on her for being a mechanic, but hearing him say it so directly made it real. She said it confirmed that his rejection of Owen had always been about his embarrassment over her job. He'd spent a year punishing an innocent baby because he was ashamed that his son had married someone who worked with her hands instead of sitting in an office. I put my arms around her and held her while she processed what had just happened. She said she'd never understood how someone could reject their own grandchild over something so meaningless as job status. I told her it wasn't about her or her work. It was about my father's need to feel superior and his obsession with appearances. She nodded, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. The next week, I had a session with Grant and told him about my father showing up and what he'd said to Ronnie. Grant listened carefully and then helped me work through the guilt I felt. I told him I felt responsible for Ronnie experiencing this class-based cruelty from my family. Grant reminded me that I didn't create my father's prejudice. He said I'd chosen to marry Ronnie knowing my father disapproved, and that showed strength, not weakness. He explained that protecting Owen from toxic behavior was the right choice, even when it was painful. He said children internalize how adults treat them, and that allowing my father access without genuine change would teach Owen that he wasn't worthy of respect. Grant helped me see that setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary for Owen's emotional well-being and for our family's health. 2 days later, my brother sent me a screenshot of my father's social media. He'd posted a vague message about ungrateful children who don't appreciate everything their parents have done for them. He wrote about being punished for honesty and how the truth hurts, but someone has to say it. My brother had commented asking him to stop the passive-aggressive posts gifts and have a direct conversation with me instead. My father deleted the comment within minutes. The next day, he posted another message about how modern parents are too sensitive and can't handle constructive criticism. My brother commented again saying that giving a baby an empty box wasn't constructive criticism. My father deleted that comment too and then blocked my brother. My brother called me laughing and crying at the same time. He said our father was completely incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. The week after that, Ronnie came home from the shop and sat down at the kitchen table without taking her boots off. She said my father had come by that afternoon. I felt my stomach drop because he'd never once visited her work in 6 years. She told me he'd walked into the customer bay while she was under a car and asked the front desk to speak to the owner. The kid at the desk told him Ronnie was one of the owners. She said she heard my father laugh. Not a mean laugh exactly. More like the sound someone makes when they think there's been a mistake. He asked again, slower, like the kid hadn't understood. Ronnie rolled out from under the car and wiped her hands and said she was the person he was looking for. She said his face did something she'd never seen before. He asked how long she'd owned it. She told him 4 years. He asked how many people worked for her. She told him 9. He stood in the middle of her shop holding his car keys and had nothing to say. Then he asked if she'd take a look at a noise his car was making. Ronnie told him to make an appointment like everyone else. My father left without another word. She said the worst part wasn't that he looked down on her. The worst part was that he'd looked down on her for 6 years without ever learning a single fact about what she did. He decided her worth from the outside and never once checked. Ronnie said she kept thinking about all the family dinners where he'd asked my brother detailed questions about his firm and never asked her one question about her work. Not one in 6 years. That was the thing that finally made her angry. I told her I was sorry. She shook her head and said she didn't want an apology from me. She wanted to know why I'd spent 6 years translating her into something he could accept instead of letting him be wrong about her. That landed hard because she was right. I'd spent years softening it, saying she was in automotive, saying anything except the plain true sentence that my wife fixed cars and was extremely good at it. I'd been managing his prejudice instead of naming it. Ronnie said she'd never held it against me because she knew I was trying to keep the peace. But she said peace that requires you to shrink your own wife isn't peace. It's just a slower kind of losing. We sat in the kitchen for a long time, and I didn't have a single argument to make. 2 months after the party, my mother came over for her weekly visit with Owen. She looked tired and frustrated. She told me that my father had been talking to his friends about the situation. He'd been painting himself as the victim of my overreaction. He told them he'd given Owen a symbolic gift to teach me about financial planning, and I'd blown it completely out of proportion. He said I was keeping Owen from him because I was vindictive and couldn't forgive one small mistake. My mother said she was frustrated because he genuinely seemed to believe his own version of events. He'd convinced himself that he'd done nothing wrong and that I was being unreasonable. She said every time she tried to talk to him about the year of rejection, he'd change the subject or act like she was attacking him. She didn't know how to get through to someone who refused to see his own behavior clearly. The following week, my uncle called and asked if my brother and I wanted to meet him for lunch without our father. We met at a small restaurant halfway between our houses. My uncle ordered coffee and then looked at both of us seriously. He said he'd been watching our father's narcissistic patterns for decades. He explained that our father had always needed to control narratives and feel superior to other people. He would rewrite history in his mind until he was always the victim or the hero. He couldn't handle anyone challenging his version of events because it threatened his self-image. My uncle said my refusal to accept my father's behavior was threatening everything he'd built. My father had spent years positioning himself as the perfect father and grandfather. Having family members publicly call out his cruelty toward Owen destroyed that image. My uncle said our father would probably never take full responsibility because it would require admitting he was wrong. He said the best we could hope for was limited acknowledgement and changed behavior moving forward. I asked my uncle during that lunch why nobody said anything before the party. He put down his coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment. He admitted the family had let my father get away with too much for years because nobody wanted the drama. Everyone saw what was happening, but they all stayed quiet, hoping it would fix itself. He said watching my father hand Owen that empty box finally made the price of keeping peace feel too expensive. My brother shifted in his seat and started talking about something that had been bothering him. He said he'd been thinking about all the times our father praised his parenting over the past year. At first it felt nice, but now he was noticing these little digs mixed in with the compliments. Our father would say things like how lucky he was that his twins had a stable home, or how grateful he should be that he married someone with a real career. My brother realized our father had been using his kids as weapons against me this whole time. The favoritism toward the twins wasn't just about loving them more. It was about making me feel like I'd failed by marrying Ronnie. My brother's voice cracked when he said he was sorry for not seeing it sooner. A few days after that lunch, my friend Colton called. He'd been at the party and seen everything. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about the empty box and how my family finally stood up to my father. Colton said it made him look at his own family differently. He'd been watching his brother enable their mother's drinking for years, and nobody ever said anything because it was easier to pretend everything was fine. Seeing my uncle and cousin speak up made him realize that sometimes love means telling the truth truth, even when it's uncomfortable. The weeks crawled by after that. Owen learned to clap his hands and Ronnie taught him to wave bye-bye. My mother came every week to visit and she'd sit on the floor playing with Owen for hours. She never mentioned my father and I didn't ask. Then 10 weeks after the party, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. He wanted to meet for coffee to move past this. I stared at the message for a while before responding. I told him I'd meet him, but Ronnie was coming with me. He needed to understand that any conversation about our family included her because she was Owen's mother and my partner. He didn't reply right away, but eventually sent back a time and place. The coffee shop was one of those chain places with uncomfortable chairs and too bright lighting. Ronnie and I got there first and sat at a corner table. My father walked in exactly on time, carrying himself stiff and formal. He saw Ronnie and his face went tight. He asked why she was there before he even sat down. This was supposed to be a father-son conversation. I told him that his rejection of Owen had everything to do with his feelings about Ronnie, so she absolutely needed to be part of this. He sat down stiffly and ordered a black coffee when the server came by. The conversation felt like pulling teeth. My father kept insisting he had nothing against Ronnie personally, but that he'd had higher hopes for my life. Ronnie leaned forward and asked him directly if he understood that ignoring Owen for a year had been cruel. My father deflected immediately, saying he'd been waiting for things to settle down. I felt my hands clench under the table. I told my father I needed to hear him say 3 specific things. First, that he deliberately ignored Owen for a year. Second, that his behavior came from being disappointed about Ronnie's job. Third, that his actions hurt an innocent child who deserved his grandfather's love. My father went completely silent. He stared at his coffee cup like it might give him answers. The silence stretched out so long that people at other tables started glancing over. After what felt like forever, my father said quietly that he may have been too harsh, but then he added that he had valid concerns about financial stability. I explained that valid concerns didn't justify treating a baby like he didn't exist. Ronnie provided well for our family through honest work and we weren't struggling. Ronnie spoke up then. She said she was proud of her work and she was tired of being treated like she wasn't good enough because she worked with her hands instead of sitting in an office. My father actually flinched, but he didn't apologize. Instead, he said he came from a different generation with different expectations. I told him that generational differences didn't excuse cruelty. Plenty of people from his generation managed to love their grandchildren no matter what their parents did for work. He looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. I watched his face as he processed what I'd said and realized he was starting to understand that he couldn't justify his behavior away with excuses about being from a different time or having different values. He opened his mouth and I watched his face work through what he wanted to say next. The silence stretched between us while Ronnie sat perfectly still beside me. My father finally spoke and his voice came out smaller than usual. He said he was sorry I was hurt. I held up my hand immediately and stopped him before he could continue. I explained that I needed him to be sorry for what he did, not sorry that I had feelings about those things. He blinked at me like I'd spoken another language. I could see him trying to understand the difference and struggling with it. His mouth opened and closed twice without any sound coming out. Ronnie leaned forward slightly and her presence reminded him that this wasn't just between me and him anymore. My father's hands twisted around his coffee cup and he stared down at the table. He admitted quietly that he handled things poorly with Owen. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I needed, but it was the first time he'd admitted any wrongdoing without immediately justifying it. I felt Ronnie's hand find mine under the table and squeeze gently. The conversation ended without full resolution, but with something that felt like the beginning of real honesty. My father stood up first and gathered his jacket against his chest like a shield. He told us he needed time to think about everything we'd said. Ronnie and I watched him walk out of the coffee shop and disappear into the parking lot. I sat in Grant's office 2 days later and recounted the entire coffee shop conversation. He listened carefully and took notes while I talked. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me directly. Grant explained that people with narcissistic patterns rarely make complete transformations. He said my father's partial acknowledgement was progress, but I needed to decide what level of relationship I could accept given his limited capacity for genuine accountability. I asked if I was being unreasonable to want a full apology. Grant shook his head and told me my expectations were completely valid, but that I might never get what I deserved from my father. He encouraged me to focus on what I could control, which was my own boundaries and my son's well-being. I left the session feeling both validated and sad. The validation came from knowing my needs were reasonable. The sadness came from accepting that my father might never be capable of meeting those needs. My mother called 3 days after the coffee meeting. Her voice sounded tired when I answered. She told me my father came home shaken from our conversation and that he'd been quieter than usual since then. I asked her what that meant exactly. She explained that he wasn't making his usual dismissive comments or trying to control the narrative about what happened. She thought the confrontation with both me and Ronnie together made the reality of his behavior harder to dismiss, but she added carefully that she wasn't sure if he was capable of the full apology I deserved. I thanked her for being honest and told her I appreciated her continued presence in Owen's life. She said she loved her grandson and that nothing would change that. After we hung up, I sat on the couch couch and stared at my phone. Ronnie came in from the garage where she'd been working and asked if I was okay. I told her about the call and she sat down beside me. We didn't say much, but her presence was enough. 3 months passed after the birthday party. Owen learned to pull himself up on furniture and babble constantly. My mother came every Tuesday to visit and play with him. Ronnie's parents hosted us for dinner every Sunday. My father remained absent except for occasional texts that said nothing meaningful. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from him. He asked if he could attend Owen's next pediatrician appointment to start being more involved. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I typed out that regular appointments weren't the place to begin rebuilding a relationship. I explained that he could come to our house for a supervised visit if he was genuinely ready to engage with Owen. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. His response came back within minutes, agreeing to the supervised visit. The day of the visit arrived faster than I expected. Ronnie took the morning off from the shop, and we spent it preparing. Owen played in his activity center while we cleaned the living room, even though it was already clean. The doorbell rang at exactly 2. My father stood on the porch holding a wrapped package and looking uncomfortable. I opened the door and let him in without hugging him. He stepped inside and immediately spotted Owen across the room. My father walked over slowly and placed the wrapped package on the coffee table. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal an age-appropriate toy instead of an empty box. Owen watched the stranger in his house with cautious eyes. My father lowered himself awkwardly to the floor and held out the toy. Owen didn't move toward him. My father's face showed hurt, but he didn't give up. He pressed a button on the toy and it made music. Owen's attention shifted to the sound. My father pressed it again, and Owen took one uncertain step closer. Ronnie and I sat on the couch watching every interaction carefully. My father attempted to engage Owen with the toy, and his movements were stiff and uncertain. He clearly had no idea how to play with a toddler. Owen reached for the toy, and my father handed it to him. Their fingers touched briefly, and my father's eyes got wet. Owen took the toy and moved back toward his activity center away from the stranger. My father stayed on the floor, looking lost. Owen remained cautious throughout the hour-long visit. He would glance at my father occasionally, but wouldn't approach him directly. My father tried several times to initiate play, but Owen treated him like any unfamiliar person. I watched my father's face as the reality of being a stranger to his own grandson sank in. His hurt was visible in the way his shoulders dropped, and how he stopped trying quite as hard. When the hour ended, my father stood up slowly from the floor. He told us quietly that he would like to try again if we'd let him. I explained gently that Owen didn't know him because he wasn't present for the first year. I added that rebuilding a relationship would take consistent effort over time. My father nodded and gathered his jacket. He left without the dramatic exit I'd seen so many times before. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from him. He wrote that the visit was harder than expected, but that he wanted to try again. I appreciated the honesty in those words. I texted back agreeing to another visit in 2 weeks, and made clear that consistency and genuine engagement were required moving forward. My brother called the next evening while I was giving Owen a bath. He said our father had been asking him questions about child development and appropriate ways to interact with toddlers. My brother thought our father was genuinely trying to figure out how to be present for Owen, even if his pride made a full apology difficult. I asked my brother what kinds of questions. He listed off things like what toys were appropriate for Owen's age and how to get a toddler to warm up to you. I felt something shift inside me hearing that my father was actually trying to learn. It didn't erase the past year, but it suggested he might be capable of change, even if that change came slowly. 2 days later, my neighbor Nolan stopped by with cookies. We sat at my kitchen table while Owen napped upstairs. Nolan told me he'd been thinking about my situation since I'd mentioned it weeks ago. He shared that his own father-in-law had rejected his first child because of family drama. Nolan explained that his father-in-law eventually came around, but that the relationship never fully recovered. He said the years of rejection left scars that couldn't be completely healed, even with later effort. Nolan looked at me seriously and told me that protecting my child's emotional well-being was always the right choice, even when it was hard. He said some grandparents never learn, and some learn too late. The important thing was that Owen would grow up knowing I fought for his worth. I thanked Nolan for sharing his experience, and felt less alone knowing someone else had walked a similar path. The next week, my father arrived exactly on time for his visit. He brought a puzzle with big wooden pieces designed for toddlers, and sat on the floor without being asked. Owen watched him from across the room while playing with blocks. My father held up a puzzle piece and smiled at Owen. Owen didn't move closer, but he didn't turn away either. My father started putting pieces into the puzzle by himself, and Owen's curiosity eventually pulled him over. He grabbed a piece and tried to force it into the wrong spot. My father gently showed him how to match the shapes, and Owen let him help. Their hands touched briefly as they worked together, and my father's eyes got wet. The visit lasted an hour, and my father asked when he could come back. I told him the same time next week, and he nodded. He started showing up every Tuesday afternoon. Owen slowly warmed to him, but still ran to Ronnie's mother whenever she visited on other days. I watched my father notice this preference and work harder to earn Owen's attention. He learned which toys Owen liked and which songs made him dance. He stopped checking his phone during visits and focused completely on Owen. The progress was slow, but it was real. 4 months after the party, party, my father asked if he could take Owen to the park alone. I was folding laundry when he brought it up, and I stopped mid-fold. I told him we weren't ready for that yet. He looked disappointed, but he didn't argue or storm out. He just asked what he needed to do to earn that trust. I explained that consistency mattered more than grand gestures, and that Owen needed more time with him before unsupervised visits made sense. My father accepted this and changed the subject to Owen's new words. The conversation felt strange because it was calm. No drama or raised voices or accusations, just a boundary stated and respected. My mother stopped by the next afternoon while my father was at his golf league. She sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee and thanked me for giving my father another chance. She said she was proud of how I'd handled everything with clear boundaries but room for growth. She admitted she was seeing her husband confront his own prejudices for the first time in their marriage. He'd asked her recently if she thought Ronnie was a good mother, and my mother had told him Ronnie was an excellent mother. My father had gone quiet after that. My mother squeezed my hand across the table and said she should have stood up sooner. I told her I was glad she was standing up now. I had a session with Grant later that week, and we talked about what realistic reconciliation looked like. He explained that people with narcissistic traits rarely make complete transformations. They might improve their behavior, but the core patterns often remained. He helped me understand that my father might never become the grandfather I'd hoped for when Ronnie was pregnant, but supervised visits where my father showed respect were better than complete separation, if Owen could have some relationship with him. Grant asked what I needed to feel safe moving forward. I told him I needed my father to maintain consistent effort and never make Owen feel less than because of who his mother was. Grant wrote that down, and we worked on scripts for addressing future boundary violations. The following Tuesday, my father arrived with a stuffed rabbit for Owen. They played together on the living room floor, and my father commented that he hoped Owen would marry well someday. The words hit me like cold water. I stopped Owen's toy mid-roll and looked at my father directly. I told him I wanted Owen to marry someone who treated him with respect and love regardless of their job. I explained that Ronnie treated me better than any lawyer or doctor could have, and that Owen deserved that same kind of partnership. My father went quiet. He picked at the carpet and didn't argue back. He just nodded slowly and asked Owen if he wanted to read a book. The moment passed without explosion, but I'd made my point clear. 5 months after the party, Ronnie's parents invited everyone to a barbecue at their house. They called my parents directly and included them in the invitation. The day arrived warm and sunny. My father showed up in a pressed shirt, looking uncomfortable. He was polite to my father-in-law, but kept his distance. He thanked Renata for having him, and she smiled warmly back. I watched him watch Ronnie's parents interact with Owen. They picked him up easily and made him laugh. They knew his favorite foods and which games he liked. My father stood apart holding a paper plate, and I realized he was ashamed. He was face to face with the grandparents who'd shown up every week while he'd stayed away. The contrast was visible in every interaction. Renata walked over to my father with a burger and asked if he wanted cheese on it. She made small talk about the weather and thanked him for coming. Her warmth was genuine despite everything he'd done to her daughter. She treated him with grace he hadn't earned, and I saw him process that reality. Ronnie came from good people who'd raised her with strong values. My father had spent a year acting like her family wasn't good enough when they'd been the ones showing up with love and consistency. Renata asked my father about his garden, and he answered quietly. She listened like his answers mattered and offered tips for his tomato plants. The conversation was ordinary, but the kindness behind it highlighted his year of cruelty. Later, my father pulled me aside near the fence. He said quietly that he was beginning to understand what he'd missed during Owen's first year. His voice had a different quality than usual, less defensive and more sad. He didn't say sorry exactly, but the regret was real in how he looked at me. I told him I appreciated him saying that. It wasn't the full apology I deserved, but it was honest emotion I hadn't heard from him before. He asked if he could help clean up after the barbecue, and I said yes. We carried plates inside together in silence. That night, Ronnie and I talked in bed after Owen was asleep. We discussed what level of relationship made sense with my father moving forward. We agreed supervised visits could continue, and that we'd slowly increase his access if he maintained respectful behavior. But we wouldn't pretend the past year hadn't happened. We wouldn't accept future cruelty or comments about Ronnie's job. Owen would grow up knowing his worth wasn't tied to status or money. Ronnie held my hand in the dark and said she was grateful Owen had me as his father. I told her he was lucky to have her as his mother. My brother called 2 days later while I was grocery shopping. He said our father had been talking more openly about our grandfather lately. Our father had mentioned how obsessed his own father was with social status and keeping up appearances. He'd shared stories about being taught to value what people thought over what actually mattered. My brother thought our father was starting to connect those childhood wounds to how he'd treated Ronnie and Owen. He wasn't making excuses, but he was finally looking at where his prejudice came from. My brother said it didn't fix anything, but maybe it meant real change was possible. I pushed my cart past the cereal aisle and told my brother I hoped he was right. 6 months after the party, my father was sitting on our living room floor during one of his weekly visits when Owen pulled himself up on the coffee table. He stood there wobbling and looking at Ronnie's parents, who were also visiting. Then Owen let go and took 3 shaky steps toward Renata sonata before falling into her arms. My father's hand flew to his mouth and tears started running down his face. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and called my mother right there in front of everyone. His voice cracked as he told her what just happened, and I heard real joy in his tone for the first time when talking about Owen. After he hung up, he looked at me with wet cheeks and said he was sorry he'd missed so much of Owen's first year. The emotion felt genuine instead of performative, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice.